Good morning. Welcome to the Asian American and Pacific Islander Council's community presented by the council today. I would like to start by just reading a description of what our council does. The goal of the Asian American Pacific Islander Council is to promote awareness and appreciation of AAPI cultures among students and the broader community. We are an advocacy group that supports the needs and interests of AAPI students. We want to foster inclusion and connectiveness among the student body. So let's start our community this morning with a word of prayer. I'll be praying in English and then in Korean. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this beautiful morning here at PUC. We thank you so much for the beauty of your creation that's here on this mountain, not just of nature, but of each and every single individual members that make up the PUC community. We thank you for this diversity that you have created and brought to this holy mountain. And as we celebrate this diversity today, may you encourage us and enlighten us through the program and the words of Dr. Ruth Chung. 하늘에 계신 하나님, 저에게 이렇게 아름다운 아침을 주셔서 감사드립니다. 하나님께서 이렇게 아름다운 자연을 만드시고 또 이렇게 많은 각기 다양한 사람들의 이런 성품과 이런 아름다운 면들을 볼 수 있는 이 대학을 주셔서 감사드립니다. 저희가 이 예배 시간 동안 하나님께서 영광 받으시고 하나님 안에서 축복받는 시간이 될 수 있도록 도와주시옵소서. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I would like to let you know that we have a special Asian-themed snack for you at the church foyer after the community service is over.
All right. Good morning, PUC. It's my joy to welcome you to today's community in celebration of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, a time to recognize the rich histories, cultures, and contributions of AAPI communities. We are especially honored to welcome back one of Pacific Union College's own, Dr. Ruth Chung. She's a class of 1994, and Dr. Chung graduated summa cum laude with a degree in psychology and went on to earn her master's and PhD in counseling psychology at UC Santa Barbara, after serving as a student missionary in Korea. She now serves as professor and director of the doctoral program in mental health leadership at the University of Southern California, where she has taught for 30 years. A recipient of a Fulbright Award to South Korea, Dr. Chung also teaches around the world in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai. As part of a global executive doctoral program, she continues to serve PUC as a valued member of our Board of Trustees. Dr. Chung lives on the USC campus with her husband, Dr. David Yu, Vice Provost at UCLA, with her two sons, Jonathan and Joshua. She also serves as faculty in residence, helping to build student community. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Ruth Chung.
Thank you so much for this warm welcome. It's very meaningful and very nostalgic for me to be here today. It didn't seem that long ago that I was sitting there, and for better or for worse, the campus hasn't changed that much since, I think there was a little typo. I graduated in 84 and not 94, so thank you for making me 10 years younger. But it's been a little over 40 years since I graduated from PUC, and this was one of my favorite places. I don't know if it's still the case, but the sanctuary was always open, and this is a place that I would come for kind of serenity and for grounding and for connecting with God. And I loved sitting in a big, quiet, silent space of this church. And there's something about this church I always called it the Ark because it's very large and cavernous, but it always seemed such a place of kind of serenity for me. So I'm truly honored and very happy to be here with you. Dr. Mariano introduced me at the end as a member of the Board of Trustees. So when I was a student sitting in your seat, I didn't even know what that was or they existed. So we are kind of the ultimate decision-making body guiding the school. But ultimately, we have one big important job, and I think we did that very well, and that is we hire the president. And then the president runs everything. And I don't know if Dr. Ralph is here, but I'm very thankful for his servant leadership and that God has brought him. And I want to thank him for his service to our community. The title of my presentation this morning is called Strangers in the Land. And this really incorporates much of my work. So I am a counseling psychologist. I'm also a scholar in Asian American studies. And what I'm about to share with you this morning is actually much more historical and sociological than psychological. And in that sense, I'm kind of borrowing from my husband and spouse, who is also a US historian, and that's kind of our connection as academics and scholars. But my main area of research and clinical interest is young adults. And that's why I have been living with students and among students at USC for the last 8 years as a faculty head at one of the largest dorms. But developmentally, I think the young adult years are the most exciting. I love the energy, I love the hopefulness, I love this kind of period of transition. I call it a portal from childhood, and this is Erik Erikson's developmental stages, in case you haven't taken intro psych already, or you have. Young adulthood is really this period of transition from childhood behind you and adulthood in front. And it's such a dynamic period of reflection, of growth, coming to terms, envisioning. And so this is really one of my favorite populations to work with, and especially in the context of immigration and family. And so that's my main area of research, is immigrant families and how immigrant families and the role of culture and immigration itself shapes the identity development of Asian American and bicultural youth in navigating their identities and the tensions between their culture of origin and then the mainstream spaces. So if you're interested in any of these topics, then I'd be glad to share some of my research and publications with you. But today, I'm going to share with you much of what I actually share with LAPD as part of, yes, the DEI workshops that I have been doing through the Korean Cultural Center, sponsored by the Korean Consulate in Los Angeles. But it's a monthly workshop that we do for law enforcement, and particularly LA Police Department and Sheriff's Department, to really help them understand the history and context of the Asian American experience. So I'm going to take you on a whirlwind overview of Asian American history, but in particular, this is what I'm hoping that you will take away from my talk this morning, is within this context of providing an overview of Asian American history and immigration, to really understand the Asian American experience, but not in an otherizing way. So I'm going to come back to this idea of Asian Americans being strangers in the land to kind of contest this idea and to deconstruct this idea that we are strangers, actually, and that I would make the case that we are all strangers in this land, and that as strangers, that we have an obligation to extend welcome and care and concern and compassion to other strangers that may be among us. But first, let's just be clear on terminology. So there are different kind of variations of terminology. Asian American, I sometimes use that as a kind of a short abbreviated version. The most complete and inclusive nomenclature would be AAPI, sometimes also shortened as API. But if you think about more intuitively, who you consider to be Asian American and not, actually there are three kind of considerations or criteria that operate simultaneously and in some cases in competition with one another. And one is a cultural kind of a criteria. And here we think of East Asian kind of Neo-Confucian based, and we think most typically of China and Japan and Korea. Then we have the racial kind of consideration, and you would think of someone who looks like me as more of the kind of the stereotypic image of an Asian American that might pop into your head. But then you also wonder about, well, what about Filipinos who don't quite look like me, Dr. Mariano, for example, right? Others who are of South Asian descent. And so that would be expanding the criteria to beyond kind of a narrow racial kind of a stereotypic idea. And I would say probably the most inclusive is a geographic one. However, this is very challenging, and that's why in some cases, some folks resist the use of AAPI, not because we want to exclude Pacific Islanders, not at all, but actually to really center their experience much more so, and to really say, but if we use this geographic criteria, which we do in terms of the official government perspective, then it covers about half of the globe. And so you wonder about a system of classification that is inclusive of half of our globe. So by no means is this a done deal or a settled thing, but I thought I would at least start with kind of an overview of the different terminology. I would, however, stipulate there is one term that has mostly kind of slipped from our common usage, but occasionally it comes up. It came up in one of my first job interviews where I was called a nice Oriental lady. You can imagine that I did not take that job, even though it was at a very good institution and was offered to me. And the reason why, it's not just a matter of political correctness, but it is factually misleading. This idea of the Orient is kind of intermingled with this idea of the mysteriousness, of the artistic. We don't go around thinking of ourselves as being exotic. So it is this exoticization of the other from a Eurocentric perspective in which they have defined the borders, and whatever is beyond their borders of the West, they have defined as the Great Orient. And so there are many other kind of, Edward Said talked about Orientalism in a very, very insightful essay. So if you're interested in that, then you can look at that. But that would be the one term, among other derogatory terms that I hope that you would be sensitive to not include or use. Another kind of quick kind of framing overview, in terms of by the numbers, there are 22 million Asian Pacific Islanders. We constitute about 7% of the total US population. In California, it's about 15%. In Southern California, we are about 25%. We are the fastest growing racial ethnic group by the census, with an 81% increase for Asian Americans. And you can see that the darker the shading and the coloring is, the higher the concentration of Asian Americans and APIs in that particular community. And perhaps you can locate your own state in that way. Oops, this is more sensitive than I thought. In case this is a good kind of way of fact-checking your own kind of knowledge and understanding of the AAPI community, these are the 6 largest groups. The Chinese are the largest, but it's a very diverse group. This would include folks from Malaysia, from Singapore, anyone who identifies as ethnic Chinese, those from who have been 3rd, 4th generation from Taiwan, to also a large group of more recent immigrants from mainland China. So this umbrella group encompasses a lot of diversity. Then you have South Asians, then Filipinos, and then the Koreans and the Vietnamese are fairly similar in size. And then the Japanese American community, which used to be one of the largest along with the Chinese in the early Asian immigration period, has really dwindled to 6%, and mainly because the influx and immigration from Japan has really declined since that early period. So in terms of kind of this historical overview, and I'm just going to give you kind of the broadest overview so that you can kind of anchor and have a sense of kind of the history of Asians in the United States. It's broken up into two large waves. So the first wave, as you can see, is very long. It's from 1849 to 1965. And then the second wave is from 1965 to the present. However, the length of the time period is balanced out by the intensity of immigration in the second half. And so you will see that majority of immigrants, or of the contemporary Asian American community, and especially the Korean American community, has immigrated since 1965. But what is important to note about immigration as a whole is something for you. If you are of any kind of immigrant background in the first or second or even third generation, I think it would really behoove you to really explore your own origin story and ask your parents or grandparents, whoever immigrated, to ask and be curious about why. Because if you think about immigration, it is actually one of the most traumatic experiences. I was 8 years old when my family immigrated from Korea. And even then, I still remember how challenging it was. And traumatic in the sense, yes, it was voluntary, but you know, to leave everything that is familiar and comfortable, and language and food and customs and tradition, to go to another country, to then, not just as a tourist or a visitor, but with this idea that you're going to then make that your permanent home for not only you and your future generations, is actually a daunting thought. And it is something that people do not enter into easily. And so in social sciences, we talk about kind of why do people immigrate in terms of two factors. We call them push factors. And the push factors would be, what are the considerations in the homeland that motivate people to leave? And you can imagine a whole range of things, but economic opportunity would be one of the main ones. Persecution would be another. Religious freedom would be another. For example, within the Korean Adventist community, a large portion of us immigrated in the 70s and in the 80s, mainly because at that time, it was very difficult to keep Sabbath. That it was a 6-day work week and schools were conducted for 6 days a week, and trying to keep the Sabbath was a very, very difficult thing. And so that was some of the push factors that a lot of Korean Adventists decided to immigrate to the United States. So ask about your own family's personal origin story of why, who immigrated and why, and what were the circumstances. Well, if there's push factors, then the other side of that equation must be pull factors, right? Just because we're motivated to leave doesn't mean that it's a foregone conclusion as to where we will go. Some countries have more open policies, others do not. Some countries have better economic opportunities. Some countries are closer. And so immigration really is an interplay of what we call push and pull factors. So in terms of the first wave of immigration, the push factor was that in Asia at the time and globally, it was not a very thriving time, if you will. Industrialization had taken place. European nations were very imperialistic, and they had finally discovered Asia and was trying to kind of make inroads and basically to exploit and dominate the natural and human resources within Asia. And so it was a lot of poverty, a lot of very difficult conditions. Then the first wave were the Chinese, and guess what happens in 1849? What happens here in California? The gold rush. So if you're a poor, starving, struggling peasant in China, and as far away as that was at the time, and as hard as it was at that time to pay for and navigate the transportation to come here, they were drawn by the lure of gold, the thought of making a fortune. But the thing to note is that early on, they were not immigrants. Immigrants come with the intent to stay. You know, in fact, I was a student missionary after I graduated from PUC, and I actually taught in Korea. And I still remember my mom before we immigrated to the United States, going to that same English SDA institution. And I remember tagging along with my mom as a 7-year-old in that one of the outings at the SDA language institution. So that was really full circle for me as one of the first Korean Americans to be invited back to Korea to teach as a native speaking English teacher, right? But we were prepared. And so that would be the distinction between an immigrant versus a refugee. But the earliest Chinese and the earliest Asian immigrants were really sojourners, and they were primarily young men. They were sent by their families as a huge investment so that they would make their fortune and come back and make the family, economically more viable. But that didn't happen for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about in a minute. And they faced extreme discrimination and exclusion. And that's why this period of the first wave is a very long, drawn-out period. And then in 1965, something very radical and dramatic happened, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, in terms of the first wave, right? So initially, they were drawn by the gold and the mining, but that dried up very quickly, as did for most others who came in search of that fool's gold. Neither did they make their fortune in gold, nor could they pay for their expensive passage back to China. So they ended up being stuck. A society of bachelor men, and they were heavily discriminated against. And so they did what nobody else wanted to do. And this is the reality of immigration, is that immigrants are welcomed and even recruited because they do the grunt work that nobody else wants to do. And that has been one of the main themes of immigration, especially in the United States. So they went into domestic work, like laundry and cooking. And then they also went into the railroad, and then eventually farming, because that's really where they had kind of local knowledge, if you will. They were predominantly farmers back in their homeland, and so they were able to apply their intensive farming techniques and contributed heavily to the breadbasket of California, which is the Central Valley and the San Joaquin Valley. They were very transformative in creating that kind of agricultural space, and also participating in migrant farm labor. But really, what defined the early experience of Asian Americans is that they filled a need for cheap, exploitable labor. That was really one of the only ways that they could stay. So here are some images that you can see in terms of the range of activities that they did. The mining and railroad work was a major part of that. There were other immigrant groups that were there, but the Chinese were given the most dangerous kind of work. So you see those baskets in the painting below. Well, they would lower the Chinese workers into these baskets. They would pound out little caverns into the solid granite Sierra Nevadas, and then they would put dynamite into those spaces and then pray and hope that your compatriots would pull you out of the way fast enough before the explosion was set off. So they were given some of the most difficult and dangerous kinds of positions. And even with their contributions, it was not recognized. So you see in the top photo there, the celebration photo at Promontory Point, Utah, when the two transcontinental railroad lines met. But you will not see in this official photo the vast numbers of Chinese railroad workers who were absolutely pivotal in helping to establish the transportation infrastructure of the United States. But what you see on the bottom photo is a celebration, 150-year anniversary of that moment in Promontory Point, and these are all the descendants of the Chinese railroad workers who came to assert and to remember and to honor the legacy of their ancestors who contributed in such significant ways to the United States. But one of the things, and this is really a very sad thing, and I share this with my LAPD workshop, and only recently has this particular horrific event been unearthed. And this was the LA Chinatown Massacre of 1871, and you see some of those images. But a mob of 500 descended on LA Chinatown, and they killed 19, and possibly the largest lynching in the US, with 15. 10 of those mobs were prosecuted, 8 were convicted, but later overturned. And among those who were killed through the lynching and dragging of their bodies through the streets of Los Angeles was a doctor as well as a young boy. So right in my own backyard and front yard. There's also kind of historically, the treatment of early Chinese was not that much different than African Americans. Their testimonies was rendered ineligible and inadmissible, along with African Americans and Native Americans. The Page Act of 1875 targeted exclusion of Chinese women, claiming that they were intended for immoral purposes. And that was because there was such a gender imbalance within that early Asian American kind of, young male society that a lot of women were sold into prostitution. But this was used as an excuse, really, to keep the women out. Because if you don't want this community to get established, then what you do is you keep the women out. And that's, again, part of the reason why that first wave is so long and drawn out. What is really notable and historically significant for us as a nation, especially as a nation of mostly immigrants, is that up until the Chinese started to come to these shores, all of the immigration had been coming from Europe. So just picture the people who are coming through Ellis Island. Now, we're pretty close to Angel Island here in San Francisco. And I don't know how many of you know the significance of Angel Island. But Angel Island is the West Coast equivalent of Ellis Island. But unlike Ellis Island, it had a Statue of Liberty that at least presumed to welcome with open arms the masses from Europe. Angel Island had no such thing. In fact, Angel Island was the place where Chinese predominantly and few others would be housed within sight of their promised land, but they could not actually cross into the promised land until they were scrutinized, until they were interrogated, until they were evaluated in all sorts of ways to see if they really had a legitimate right to enter into the United States. And this is also important if you're not already seeing the visual distinction between European immigration, which is mostly Caucasian white. This is for the first time in our nation's history, we have a group of an alien race. That's what they were called. They were called an alien race. They were deemed to be so different, so unlike us in terms of how America saw itself, that they were called aliens unfit for assimilation. They were called the Yellow Horde, the Yellow Peril. And this led to a historic immigration ban in 1882. And I find it shocking and horrific and so saddening that I'm hearing the same kind of rhetoric now that existed around Asian immigration back then. Immigration ban. So these are some of the images that reflected and fed into the public frenzy in terms of the anti-Asian and Asian hate, the earliest forms of Asian hate, even before the COVID pandemic. So these are some cartoons from Harper's Weekly. This is called Pacific Chivalry. And if you remember your SAT words, chivalry, right? What a paradoxical and ironic terminology to depict this particular image. Here's a very interesting recast of Ellis Island and Lady Liberty, unlike the welcoming version of Lady Liberty. And this is meant to reflect Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. That sense of threat, and you see the caricatures, the dehumanization, and the depiction of Asians as the other, not like us, not human. And finally, this leads to Uncle Sam in the bottom corner photo there, signing and kicking out the unwanted, the aliens, the horde, the aliens unfit for assimilation, and trying to kick them out with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So that basically stopped immigration from China. That began in 1849 to 1882. You can see that it didn't take that long. But again, for a lot of historical reasons, which we don't have time to get into, it opened a stream of immigration from Asia. So after the Chinese, then the Japanese came. But after an initial period of even recruiting them to work in the sugarcane fields in Hawaii, we felt like, oh no, we don't really want you, especially when they got uppity and they started to protest their harsh exploitative conditions. That's when all of a sudden it was like, oh no, we don't really want you after all. So there were all sorts of things happening in Hawaii at the time. And so the gentleman's agreement was passed between Japan and the United States in 1907 to keep out the Japanese. And by that time, Koreans were included because by that time, Japan had kind of solidified its colonial kind of overtake of Korea. South Asians, they created this ridiculous, they looked at the map of the world and they just grew a triangle. And it just happened to fit neatly over the Indian subcontinent. Say, well, anyone from this barred zone can't enter. And that was because everyone else who was coming outside of those areas were already excluded. But they made no pretense. We as a nation made no pretense to hide and disguise our attempts to exclude people in ways that we had never instituted an immigration ban against the French, for example, or the Poles, or the Irish. But so you get the difference, you get the contrast between Ellis Island European immigration and this kind of, this alien race of people. Filipinos was an interesting challenge because by that time, US had colonized the Philippines. And so the Filipinos, as a colony, were traveling with US passports. But after a while, we thought, oh, we want to keep these people out too. They called Filipinos our little brown brothers. And we wanted to keep them out. So they said, okay, the Chinese McDuffie Act said, oh, well, we're going to start the process of granting you independence. But with that, we're going to slap on a quota of no more than 100 Filipinos can enter the United States at a given year. But perhaps the most telling historical evidence of the salience of race. And when we talk about race, we no longer think about it, at least serious scholars of race and of ethnicity, we do not subscribe to the original notion of race as this classification system based on appearance, phenotype and visual appearance. But along with that differentiation, there were certain moral, characterological assumptions that were supposed to go along with having different kind of skin tone and so on and so forth. We no longer subscribe to that kind of endemic notion or understanding of race. However, we recognize that race still matters now, perhaps even more than ever, but as a socially constructed reality. Much in the way that we differentiate now between sex and gender, sex being kind of the biological, how you are born, but gender being the clothes and the programming that has been given by society to being born a particular gender. We make that same without a different term, and perhaps we should come up with a different term, but we now call that the social construction of race. That we have given meaning and attribution to the ways in which people look different without buying into any kind of a kind of an inherent notion that the way that people look different matters in any kind of substantial way, right? But race does matter, and I will share that with you in terms of these photos. Given that we are a nation of immigrants, except for the Native Americans, and except for that group, who's probably the most marginalized of any identified ethnic group, on any marker of collective well-being, life expectancy, infant mortality, economic, home ownership, in all of those ways, it is actually, I think, one of the most shameful aspects of our nation, both historically and in an ongoing way, that the Native Americans are the most marginalized. And honestly, they're the only ones who can tell anybody else, go back to where you came from. So whenever you hear that, I just find that so ironic and so humorous, because I did hear that in playgrounds. Go back to where you came from. Well, if you want to play that game of kind of origin, then we all need to go back. The only people who can tell everyone off are the Native Americans. They are sequestered as foreigners on their own land. And that, again, is a historic and ongoing tragedy as that is. But here's the thing. So because we are a nation of immigrants, for the most part, our forefathers set provisions for becoming a citizen. And again, this is remarkable because not that many countries around the world actually offer that kind of privilege. I do teach and travel a lot in Dubai and in Qatar. And in Qatar in particular, there are 10% of the population are native, Qataris. And the rest are imported immigrants. Now, they're all Muslim, or most of them are Muslim, from Pakistan and so on and so forth. But that citizenship is so highly guarded that it takes an act by the emir under very special circumstances to grant citizenship, Qatari citizenship, to someone who is not born and an original, that you can claim, you can trace your identity to one of the Bedouin tribes that from that area. But we as a nation, our forefathers did set forth in a way in which we became a naturalized citizen. So if you remember your college, senior, government class, once you are a naturalized citizen, you can enjoy all the benefits of citizenship, except for what? You cannot become president of the United States, right? So you can, I won't go into some of that more recent political kinds of maneuverings around that. But so Asians, so they came, whether they liked it or not, they stayed, and then they decided to make this their home. And some of them, like Mr. Ozawa there, wanted to become a naturalized citizen. So he applied, but he was denied. And then he said, why not? All these other immigrants who came even later than he did were being granted a naturalized citizenship status. He said, why not? So he challenged this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court ruling, they said, oh, Mr. Ozawa seems like a model citizen. They even said that he seemed eminently qualified under the statutes. He was a civic leader, he was a fine, upstanding member of his community. So did the Supreme Court grant him citizenship? They did not. They said, we're sorry, Mr. Ozawa. And of course, I'm taking some artistic liberty here with characterizing this, but they said, Mr. Ozawa, you seem eminently qualified. Unfortunately, you're not white. And so they actually basically invoked the original Immigration and Naturalization of 1790, which had a clause that had not needed to be tested before, but the clause said you had to be white. And therefore, they said, Mr. Ozawa, we're sorry, but you seem like a really good guy, but the law's the law, and it says that you can't really, you're not white, so you cannot be a naturalized citizen. You see in the other photo here, a gentleman by the name of Bagat Tind, and he was denied citizenship But then he said, but wait a minute, I'm kind of different from Mr. Ozawa. Now look at the two of them, and you will see, again, I go back to what I said at the very beginning, there are different kind of criteria for inclusion and exclusion, and one is a racial one. And so Mr. Tend is of, he was of Sikh origin, kind of from South Asia, and he said, but wait a minute, I'm not Mongoloid, because that's the technical term for Asian race, is Mongoloid. Isn't it interesting? And I'm being kind of sarcastic in this. Isn't it interesting that of the three racial classification terminology, Caucasian we still use in a very neutral, descriptive way, but Mongoloid and Negroid, isn't that interesting how these kinds of connotations around terminology? One is still like use, but the others are not, for very clear, offensive kinds of meanings and attributions. But Mr. Tin said, but look at me, I'm not Mongoloid. And then he got all these anthropological experts, and they testified and wrote briefs, and they said, indeed. And the Supreme Court said, oh yes, Mr. Tend, we see that these anthropological experts, who are racial experts at the time, agree with you that you are not Mongoloid. So, did they grant him citizenship? If they did, I wouldn't be asking you. They did not. And you say, why? Well, they created a new legal precedent in their ruling. And what they said was, yes, technically you are white. The anthropological experts are saying that. However, you're not really white. The understanding of the common man is the criteria that they invoked. What is that? It's the average Joe on the street. That's what it is. They said, you know what? You may be technically Caucasian, but the average Joe on the street, if they saw you, would not consider you to be a white person. So they actually set a legal precedent in invoking this criteria of the understanding of the common man as the basis for denying Mr. Tend, and therefore all other South Asians who are technically Caucasian but from the region of Asia, the ability to become a naturalized citizen. I don't think I put this in there, but when do you think this Naturalization Act of 1790 was overturned and replaced? Take a wild guess. It was in 1952, called the McCarran-Walter Act. And it was really because after World War II, US had positioned ourselves as the leader of the free democratic world, and we felt that it didn't look good for us to have these outdated racist immigration policies. And so it was really in the aftermath, in the Cold War era of post-Cold War, post-World War II Cold War era, that we overturned this Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1790. So that brings us up to the second wave, and I'm going to go really quick here. I'm going to go over this really quickly because I do want to talk about something else. So 1965, there was a major immigration reform. And again, this is part of that, post-World War II era, and you can see just visually how that particular law transforms the landscape of the United States in terms of immigration. Right? And so you see in the earlier part, very little immigration from Asia and other parts, mostly from Europe. But after World War II, and especially after post-1965, you see the red zone with a significant increase of immigration from Asia and in Latin America, and a decline of immigration from Europe. And if you look at Asian Americans in particular, you see that the composition of the Asian American community shifts from predominantly Japanese and Chinese to all other AAPIs, including Koreans and Filipinos and Vietnamese in this post-1965 immigration. In terms of the contemporary experience of Asian Americans, there's one particular reality that must be noted as part of this discussion, and that is, despite this long history and presence of Asians in the United States, we have always been seen as perpetual foreigners. Where are you from? And when I say, well, I'm from Los Angeles, no, that's not what I mean. Where are you really from? Now, depending on my mood, I'll say, no, I'm really from LA. Even though I know what they mean. And I think most Asian Americans, for me as a first generation, I came here as an immigrant, became naturalized. I can put up with that. But I have Asian American colleagues who are third or fourth generation Chinese and Japanese American, who have like any other immigration generation, have very little vestiges of their culture, and yet because of this racial uniform, as sociologists would call it, are still treated as foreigners, as strangers in their own land. Being complimented, why, oh, your English is so good, which by the way is improper grammar. And I still remember Michelle Kwan. Some of us may be old enough to remember how Michelle Kwan, a ice skating darling of America, for her hard work and ethic, when she lost in the final round to Tara Lipinski in 1988, MSNBC headline read, "American beats out Kwan." So you get this idea. Even though she's born in the United States and in the social media was seen as the darling of America, embodying the values and cultures of America, it was still in the end an American beats out Kwan. So this is the reality. This is the paradoxical reality of Asian Americans. On one hand, we're still seen as that perpetual foreigner, right? And there is this rendered invisibility of Asian Americans with, post-1965, the hyper-visibility in a very narrow, stereotypic way of Asian Americans as the model minority. The rise of the model minority image was not by coincidence, in my humble opinion. It was termed in 1966 in a New York Times magazine. What's happening in the 1960s, in the late 1960s? What's happening? Civil rights protests. So I find this timing very, very coincidental, that this Asian racial minority group that have been largely ignored are all of a sudden put on a pedestal and talked about as the model minority. Model for whom? Model for whom? And all of a sudden they recognize, oh yes, they too experience discrimination. Yes, they too are the minorities, but they're not out in the street protesting, talking about inequality. They're quietly going about their business, keeping their head down, studying hard, getting those good jobs. Look at them, the model minority. And this kind of political power play still is a dominant theme within the racial landscape of America. Whenever they want to attack affirmative action, they always trot out some Asian American who claim reverse discrimination in Harvard and such and say, oh, well, and we've just been used as kind of a political front for all sorts of issues related to race and systemic racism. So here again is something that we need to recognize and understand, this paradox of the Asian American experience between the rendered invisibility of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners with the selective hypervisibility of Asian Americans. I'm gonna skip to, so sociologists, in looking at the broad overview of Asian migration to the United States, articulated 3 different models of immigration. First one, they said, is an Anglo-conformity. And so, if you think about Anglo-Saxon is a British cultural standard, that people must come in colonial period, speak English, and so on and so forth. Then by mid-1800s, we evolved into this melting pot model. And finally, we have this model of cultural pluralism as indicated by the salad bowl. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a quiz. Being a professor of over 35 years, I can't help but give you a quiz at the end. And this will be our wrap-up. Read this quote and take a wild guess. See who is the person being quoted. And who is the group being talked about? All right? So he, this famous person that all, if not most of you would recognize, had misgivings about them, these people. Okay? Because of their clannishness, their little knowledge of English, their own ethnic press, and the increasing need of interpreters. He was not for refusing them admission entirely, but he urged better distribution and more mixture. Basically, they needed to mingle, they needed to assimilate, they needed to blend in instead of standing out so much. So, just as for the fun of exercise and committing an answer, turn to the person next to you and just say two things. Who do you think is the speaker being quoted, and who do you think is the group being talked about? It was Benjamin Franklin, and he was talking about those pesky Germans. Yeah. Wow. Benjamin Franklin complaining about those pesky Germans who were resisting assimilation during the period of Anglo-conformity. Anglo-conformity was only in the minds of the British. That was the idealized model, but it wasn't being practiced. Even during the period of melting pot, here's the thing. In Pennsylvania, on the eve of the Revolution, 1/3 of the population was comprised of Germans. And they used their language and social institutions to resist assimilation, even down to the second and third generation. How effective were they in resisting assimilation? Well, by 1850, at the height of the melting pot model, there were 6,000 Germans, and 4,000 of whom were native-born in Milwaukee. Take a wild guess as to how many of them had married outside and married non-Germans. You ready for this? 6,000, okay? And look at this linguistic map of the United States. So this is a map when you take out English and Spanish as the most dominant languages spoken in that state. Then this is an ethnic linguistic map of the United States. We see Tagalog. We see Vietnamese. We see Navajo. But look at how many states are in orange. German. This is now. This is not eve of the revolution. This is not 1850. This is now. And this is the most commonly identified ancestry. Look at the swath of blue who identify as German. So what is the takeaway? We have always been a land of strangers. It's just a matter of when you came outside of the Native Americans. Asian Americans have been portrayed and seen as perpetual foreigners. We are indeed strangers, but we are no stranger than anyone else. Our experience in history is quintessentially an American experience. We all belong here. Each one of us needs to locate our own experience within this broader racial and ethnic landscape of America and embrace our diversity as our greatest asset. Diversity is not easy. It presents so many challenges, and yet diversity is our greatest strength. It is what makes America great, not some return to some never-existing version of some society of the lily white, as Benjamin Franklin called it. That even in a period of Anglo-conformity, when it was espoused as a model, it was not being practiced. We have always been a nation of diversity, of cultural pluralism. And so I invite us all to consider our collective experience as strangers in this land. And more importantly, I do want to make that connection. In Leviticus 19:34, it says very clearly, you must treat the foreigner living among you as a native born and love him as yourself. Does that seem vaguely familiar? Yes. For you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. And I am the Lord your God. And I invite us to reflect on where we are as a society, but also bring it local. While racial and immigration diversity is one visible and kind of broader social dimension, there are ways in which there are strangers among us. And I invite each of us to reflect on how we might treat the strangers among us as natives and as God's people. So this is my hope and my prayer for you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Bow with me for prayer. Father God, we thank you so much that we render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but to you what belongs to you. And we are your created beings. We are your children, diverse in our experiences, our cultures, our race. And we thank you for the diversity of PUC. As we leave this place, give us your power and empower us with your spirit, that we may love you with all our hearts, minds, souls, bodies, and strength, and love our neighbor, our brothers and sisters, as we love ourselves. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.